My name is Maya Reyes. I'm 42. And if you asked most people what I do for a living, they'd smile politely and slot me into some neat little box. Logistics, delivery, supply chain. To my neighbors, I haul oversized coolers and sometimes drop off catered meals. To my sister and her in-laws, I'm the eccentric sibling who never quite got comfortable with the normal path. To the strangers at upscale parties, I am an amusing anecdote, the woman who drives the big truck. But there is another life stitched under the flannel shirts and grease-stained jeans. A life they don't see because it isn't meant for open conversation over hors d'oeuvres. For 2 decades, I have been a quiet licensed ghost inside the machinery of national security. When the people who chart foreign policy travel, I am part of the thin, invisible chain that keeps them alive. My hands know how to clean a firearm while my mind knows how to choreograph a motorcade through a city grid. My van, which reads on their mailboxes as a meal kit delivery vehicle, is modified beyond cosmetic insult. It's an armored, communications-rich, tactical conveyance that can carry a human being from a kill zone to safety while the whole city thinks it's just another driver on a coffee run. That evening at the Hargrove Estate, the kind of house whose driveway could park a small fleet of Ferraris without disturbing the hedges, my double life collided with the polished fiction my family had built for itself. My sister Lena had insisted I come. Wear something festive. It's a celebration, not a press conference, she'd told me over the phone, voice buttery, tone full of that particular sweetness she reserves for interactions that require social polishing. Lena is 34, a real estate attorney with the face of someone who has never had to choose between survival and success. She bathes in light and compliments. She's the kind of person who knows how to make a phone call that makes entire rooms rearrange themselves. When she introduced me, the sister who drives for a living, to her fiance's parents and their social set, the laughter was gentle and the pity was loud. Her voice carried, "This is Maya. She runs errands for us now, helps with deliveries. Isn't that right?" The room folded around that description like a petal closing. People smiled kindly as if they were looking at a small, quaint exhibit of someone else's choices. They didn't see the small, locked box in my truck that contains classified access cards. They didn't know my badge as a quiet, gold-edged authority. They had no idea that under my coat, under the cheap dress Lena chose for me, I still smelled faintly of solvent and gun oil from tending to a sidearm. That is more than a prop, they thought. I was funny in the way the rest of the world finds, charming the bit players in their own narratives. I wasn't offended at first. I had been building a career that valued humility in a strange way. The more silent you are about your competence, the less likely you are to be targeted by the press or by someone with motive and means. A quiet professional survives better than a loud one. So I let Lena tell our story her way. She had turned my training, my debriefs, my deployments into a folkloric logistics job for family consumption. It was easier for dinners, for holidays, for her to be the shining child and me the tragic, enduring satellite. The house smelled of lemon oil and $1 million lifestyle. There were orchids arranged with surgical precision and waitstaff, who moved through the crowd like practiced sailors on champagne seas. I walked in wearing a navy knit dress that Lena had insisted would soften my edges. It didn't. The pleats hugged wrong places, and I felt the fabric like a canvas stretched too tight over an engine. My boots, the tactical boots I had abandoned in the car to conform to the visuals they preferred, were left behind in the trunk, and I felt lighter but wrong. Like an operative who had handed over his tool belt. They handed me a glass of sparkling water like it was a prop and placed me in the role they'd rehearsed, good-natured, unambitious, grateful for any opportunity to be useful. My life had been reduced to a narrative that fit into an afternoon conversation. I smiled, I deflected questions about my route, and I listened to my parents' small, embarrassed chuckles when strangers asked where Lena's sister worked out my father's. I slid past my face and rested on the shoulders of those more like Lena, men who seemed to have their fate cushioned by corporate boards and campaign contributions. My mother, always a master of mise-en-scène, kept her napkin folded just so and made eye contact with the room as if to say, "Yes, that is my daughter. Isn't she charming?" Their discomfort with my world was not malicious. It was more like not wanting to know. The plumbing under their house leaking into their parlor before the night could calcify into nothing more than another family footnote. My phone chimed with the light and sound reserved for secure devices. I had been careful all evening not to take calls in the open. Secrecy is a discipline, a respect both for the people I protect and for the rules that allow them to survive. But the screen pulsed red, central. My heart moved from beneath my ribs to my throat. I stepped into the hallway. The music dimmed. The laughter blurred. Lena's smile tightened into a question I didn't answer. On the other end of the secure line, the voice was quick, alert. Reyes, immediate extraction. Motorcade boxed on Route 12, northbound. Secretary Grant's limo disabled. Sniper reports unconfirmed, but shots fired. You are 20 minutes tops with vehicle access. You are the nearest hard asset. Move now. I felt, in a way that people who have known adrenaline call as a friend know, a familiar clarity bloom. Nothing about that moment was theatrical. It was duty. It was muscle memory. I didn't have time for embarrassment or for the private grief that my family's misinterpretation caused. For once, their version of me, the delivery driver who runs errands, could be leveraged into an advantage. No one would suspect the van at the end of the drive. My mother stepped into the foyer just as I gathered my things. She did not look at me with concern. She looked at me with the same small foolishness she wore when asking favors. Maya, honey, if you're going to be out tonight, could you run by the market on the way home? Lena forgot she started in that tone, like a lever she could flip to get me to stay small. Now is not a good time, I said. The words were softer than the steel behind them. She blinked, offended, and raised the silver cake knife she had been using to prop open a napkin holder. You're not leaving before the cake, she said, a line she had practiced for years in her head when the world required a small ceremony. It's tradition. This is Lena's night. Her tone insinuated that duty could wait for cake. In the rhythm of things that make me who I am, there is only one question at a time. Is someone alive? If the answer is no, you cook. If yes, you move them. If a bad man is executing an agenda, you become the noise that interrupts it. I watched Lena's expression go, through a flicker of irritation and then recompose itself into the look she'd practiced before. I left for a deployment 10 years prior. The slightly amused, slightly condescending sister who knows better what is expected than you do. It's only for 20 minutes, Lena said, as if there were anything that needs to be slightly inconvenienced when someone's life hangs in the balance. I left anyway. The backyard seemed farther than the polite distance people keep from reality. My armored van, benign to the world, was an embarrassment to my family, a monstrous thing with mud on its tires and a hint of diesel in its posture. To them it was an eyesore, a utilitarian dysfunction stuck in the wrong lane of their aesthetic. I vaulted into the driver's seat, slid the vest over my party dress, and clipped my boots on without looking at them twice. The engine rumbled like a living thing. I hit the lights and took the fastest route I knew. I didn't have time to pivot into the person they imagined. I had to be the one I was. The battery contacts on my radio felt like fingers around the throat of the city. Route 12 was gridlocked, cars fused together, red brake lights a vein that pulsed into the dark. The lead SUV of the motorcade sat like a wounded animal, its grille singed and its occupants packed tight. A panicked chorus of bystanders and flashes from phones turned the scene into a slow-moving theater dash of dash macabre. Men in suits braced the wounded vehicle, their faces white with adrenaline. My truck tore the median like a seam, mounted the curb, and parked parallel to the chaos. I stepped into the carnage with the efficiency of someone who has rehearsed chaos 1,000 times. I flashed my credentials to a young county officer who had the wide-eyed panic of someone still in the first act of an ordeal. He took a breath the size of the world and let me pass. Inside the disabled limo, the Secretary of State, a man named Michael Grant, sat with his jaw clenched, eyes wide but steady. When he looked at me, there was a moment of recognition that had nothing to do with the fabric I wore or the shoes on my feet. Agent Reyes, he said. The title carried an entire profession's worth of trust. We moved him under a flanking of bodies and pushed through the press of an anxious crowd. My truck's doors closed on the briefcase with a thud that sounded like an accounting of the night's worth of choices. Sirens melted into the background. The plan was simple and brutal. Move fast, stay low, keep the asset inside a rolling steel coffin until backup arrived. Take the Hargrove estate, I ordered into the radio with authority. Naming the most obvious place, the party location I just left, because of the decent walls and the proximity and because there were fewer variables there than anywhere else close enough. I steered through the snarled veins of the city and headed back toward the estate that had, moments ago, been a stage for my humiliation. When we arrived, I drove straight up the driveway and stopped as close to the steps as my vehicle would allow. The mansion's front doors were open, and in a surreal twist, the same people who had been making jokes about my life moments ago now stood in their own doorway, stunned into spectatorship. For a fractal second, it looked like a movie set, tuxedos, pearls, a spilled glass of wine like a red prophecy on white carpet. I walked through the foyer with boots that made no sound on luxury wood, my tactical vest hugging the navy dress Lena had chosen for me. The room was frozen in a tableau of polite confusion. People gaped like they'd been caught mid-breath by a breeze that smelled distinct of gunpowder and life. A security breach, I announced, not to be theatrical but to command the room. Clear the entrance now. It was a directive dressed as a statement, and for a few seconds every human in the house realized what the words meant. They shuffled, fingers finding the backs of chairs and clutching at cocktail napkins like talismans. My mother, still clutching that cake knife like it was the scepter of her social life, looked at me as if I had stepped off a stage and into a different role entirely. Then the secretary walked in behind me. Hair slightly disheveled, the pall of smoke clinging to his jacket. He scanned the room and then set his eyes on the handful of faces that had turned to stare. He walked straight toward me and in front of all of them placed his hand on my shoulder. "Agent Reyes," he said, and the weight of his gratitude was a physical thing. "That call you made to redirect us, that was the right hand on the map. You saved time. You saved lives." His words did what the rest of the evening never managed. They reframed the picture. The genteel cluster who had been laughing at my perceived shortcomings now had a different lens. Gerald Hargrove, the host, a man whose donations had the power to tilt campaigns, reached blindly for a recovery. He stepped forward, offering a smile that had all the flavor of an apology he'd been taught to give. "We didn't know," he stammered. Of course we would have, but apologies were inadequate. The air between us too redolent with what had happened. And what had been taught the secretary didn't let the theater of social standing define our reality. He spoke as if this were a briefing. "Your family should know she is the reason I'm still moving," he said. He turned and looped his hand outward like a conductor who'd just finished a symphony. "This is Agent Maya Reyes of the Diplomatic Protection Unit. She coordinated the extraction under fire." A hush of comprehension fell. Lena's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of her element. My parents, who had been the active audience of a story that reduced my worth to something quaint, now had to confront the reality they'd been erasing. Guilt is a cold, immediate thing. It traces the face like frost. Everything that had been dismissed as harmless. Small talk on the drive over, the coupons taped to our refrigerator at home. The suggestions that I should take a real job. The way they characterized my work as quaint errands, all of it condensed into a moment that either softened people or hardened them. My mother's eyes filled with tears, not because she'd been cruel, though she had been, but because she had been confronted with her own small cruelty reflected back by someone who had just carried the Secretary of State to safety. Men from the Secret Service began to move through the house, securing rooms, checking sight lines, building a perimeter like stitchwork. A loud-throated agent who had been part of the motorcade barked orders, and suddenly their presence made the house an operating room rather than a stage set for social triumphs. The guests, young lawyers, and imported smiles were shepherded away in clusters. As if polite society understood that tonight it was less important to look good than to be gone. Gerald approached with a limp apology and an outstretched hand. "Agent Reyes," he started, his voice smaller somehow, as if the currency of his voice had been devalued by events. This was an extraordinary. You tried to have me arrested," I said flat, not wanting his patronage. "You tried to box me in for your convenience." He winced. "We were frightened. We were protecting our family." His nervousness shone through. You thought I was a caricature," I finished for him. "You thought I was convenient. You misread a life." My father, whose face had always been a map of comfort-seeking and defensive normalcy, took a half-step toward me and then stopped. The room felt like a courtroom waiting on the judge's ruling. "You could have told us," my mother said, voice small, wanting to bind herself in explanation. We just wanted to help. Help, I repeated. The word had been everywhere in my childhood. It had been used to dress up interference, to make bribery look like love. Help is not the same as insisting you define my value because it makes you feel better. The secretary watched quietly, as if he'd been given an anecdote that proved something larger, that we confuse the face we present with the worth we possess. What matters, he said eventually, is the work that was done. Agent Reyes did not ask for thanks. She did not ask for recognition. She did the job because it needed doing. The words settled in the parlor like a verdict. Lena's expression collapsed into something raw, less anger, more the realization that for years she had worn a mask of entitlement that isolated her. Her engagement ring glittered with a guilt she had never anticipated. People who make their identity from being admired are brittle when admiration is pulled away, when the secondary convoy rolled in, and the helicopter came to hover like a white gull over the treetops. We moved. The secretary walked to the open back of my truck and climbed in. Before the door shut, he turned, and a voice that carried like promise sighed, "Your work keeps me honest, Agent Reyes. Remember that." We drove away through a sky pierced by the searchlight, sirens echoing like distant drums. The world resumed its usual noises after a time. Traffic will always find a way to return to its hum. The phone call today will be tomorrow's memory, and life will keep accruing the small things we call normal. But something had shifted in me. The humiliation at the party had not vanished. Humiliation leaves grooves that new events do not erase. But there had been a leveling. The people who had been willing to cement me into a comfortable story for their narratives were now facing the chisel dot later. When the debrief was wrapped and the secretary was safe and the helicopters had roared back into the night, I sat alone in my truck in a parking lot that smelled of old rain. My hands still trembled from the adrenaline, the slight aftershocks that follow hand to hand with danger. My phone buzzed with the kind of message you expect from the people who live in the net of small social gossip. Lena's text came in. "I'm sorry," she wrote. "I didn't know. Are you okay?" I read it and left it. Forgiveness isn't an instant switch for me. It's not even a linear process. I had been raised on a diet of duty and restraint. My choice had long been to bear the burden of silent competence rather than to demand validation. For many years, that felt like the only reasonable way to be. But standing there in my fortress of a vehicle, watching the way the world had reshuffled itself in the wake of a real emergency, I understood that validation, the type that erupts through deeds, can be antidotal to family narratives. But the cure is not always the same. A few days later, the office deposited a hazard pay, acknowledgement with reimbursement for the night's chaotic hours, the kind of paperwork that, in some offices, becomes a quiet archive of a life of service. I looked at the number and did not feel triumph. It simply registered as a ledger entry. Money was never the point. The point was that my profession allowed me to make choices that sometimes demanded costs from my personal life. Some choices cost embarrassment and derision. Some choices cost relationships that were already performing to someone's preferred script. There were ripples afterward. Newspapers with shallow columns called the event a security scare and then recycled. Contempt for the wealthy's indignant privacy. There were interviews, quiet and carefully vetted, where I was allowed to say only what the Bureau permitted. I did not demand the limelight. I had always preferred to be the instrument rather than the instrument taker. But the story, now outside our walls, had a capacity to peel open more than the surface. Weeks later, maybe months. Because family time and departmental time run on different clocks, I drove past Lena's office and saw her through the glass as she left. She had looked small in a winter coat, her scarf slightly askew. She waved, and as she did, she looked up and caught my eye. For a few heartbeats, we existed outside our performances. She mouthed an apology, and I nodded doubt we met in a coffee shop that smelled of roasted beans and something distinctly safe. She reached for my hand the way someone does when they want to anchor themselves to another human. She asked how I managed the stress, whether after that night I wanted to continue the work. Her questions were sincere. The conversation that followed was not a confrontation but a negotiation. We did not perform. We spoke. "You should have told us," she said, not accusing, more like wondering aloud. "Did you think we'd understand?" "It wasn't that you couldn't understand," I answered, my voice steady. "It was that I understood how convenient your narrative was for you. You wanted a role to play, the successful sister and the struggling sister. That narrative props you up because it's easier than facing complexity. I paused. You are not a monster, Lena. You are a human being who chose comfort over curiosity. She cried then, not theatrical tears, but real ones that leave tracks down the face. This time the tears were for the reality of having used another's life as a shorthand. I didn't mean to, she said. I thought I was protecting you in some way. People like clarity. I hugged her. That hug was awkward. There is a certain distance that remains between people who have kept secrets and the people who are discovering them. But it was a start. We didn't sweep things under the rug. We folded them and then we folded them again. And then left them to exist. That night I went home and stood in my kitchen. The place where I clean my sidearm before bed the way a surgeon sharpens his scalpel after closing a wound. The ritual of cleaning a weapon is meditative for me because it reduces complexity to motion, disassemble. Clean, oil, reassemble. The metal cools and becomes obedient. My hands move with trained accuracy. The process is mechanical and kind, and in those small mechanistic gestures there is a kind of returning, a return to clarity. A return to what is mine, but the story did not simply end with me getting the respect I had earned. Families are slabs of ice that crack differently. My mother started to call more often. The calls were clumsy at first, full of faux manners and the old worrying questions. She wanted to know if I was eating. She wanted to know if I needed money, a recurring script that had always been the softest sarcasm of our shared life. Her tone had shifted from being quietly dismissive to plainly anxious. I let some calls ring and answered others. My father, who'd made the early crack about community college and applauded my perceived preference for a simple route, sent a letter. It was a thin piece of paper, folded and refolded. The kind of letter you write when you want to say something important but don't have the courage to say it out loud. He admitted in staccato sentences that he had been afraid of the unknown, that he had been ashamed when his daughter's life refused to fit the chart he had printed in his mind. He wanted to understand. He wanted to ask for forgiveness. Forgiveness is not a switch. I wrote back. I didn't promise instant reconciliation. I explained how the work weighs on you. I described not the classified details but the shape of a life lived in service, calendars, debriefs, the small rituals that keep the machine from failing. I told him that my identity was not a story he could retell to make himself comfortable. I did not ask him to be proud. I asked him to be truthful. Not long after, we sat together on the back steps of our parents' small house, the American flag at the porch pole biting at the wind. It was colder than our family dinners had ever been. He watched the roads and the roofs as if in search of some perspective. We didn't have many dramatic speeches. We had instead a slow, long conversation that lasted into the evening, where he listened and I spoke, and the old weight shifted to something like equilibrium, and Lena and I moved forward differently. She insisted on learning more about the work, not the classified bits but how we prepare, what matters in the field. She began to see the contours of a life that had, for so long, been simplified into a novelty. Her husband-to-be, whose initial impression of me hinged on the shape of my truck, rather than its mission, had to meet the reality that the person he was marrying shared a family of secrets. Love, it turns out, can survive knowledge. It can also be tested by it. Theirs was tested and, in time, weathered into something real, not performative. There are no clean endings in lives like this. There are only moments of truth stitched into the fabric. I still get the jokes at holiday dinners. I still get the sideways glances and the comments that try to reduce a dangerous career into a comic anecdote. But now those comments sit on a different shelf. There is a school of people who will always seek to flatten complexity into digestible sound bites, and they have always existed. My life, however, was no longer a commodity for their comfort. For the public, I remained a name people heard in passing. For my family, I became a story with more texture. For me, I remained committed to the work. I return often to the idea that the most dangerous jobs never come with a crowd or applause. They come with a morning debrief and a return to whatever small fragment of normal life you can carve out. When you do something that keeps someone else alive, the world may not applaud you, sometimes it will ridicule you, but occasionally it recognizes you in a way that moves mountains of denial. Some weeks later, I received an invitation that surprised me. It was not glittering or ceremonial. It was a typed note, the kind issued from offices with small budgets for civility and a big number for protocol. The secretary himself requested a small meeting at a local operations center to thank those who had played roles in that night's extraction. I attended, of course. He greeted me with the same steady eye as before. "Your mother called me," he said offhandedly, as if he was closing a loop. "She asked to know if you were okay." I told her the truth. It was, in its way, the strangest compliment. The later afternoon sun cut through the blinds and made dust look like stars. He stood in a movement that was not scripted for the cameras, shook my hand and offered a simple courtesy. "There are many who will try to define your life. Let them continue to do the work." Those words did not make me cocky. They made me quieter, more resolute. I had spent too long people-pleasing and curating. My work demands a clarity of focus that is refreshed by an awareness that while public validation is fleeting, the work itself defines me. If anything, the Hargrove party had been an accident that shows how we perform our own lives for the comfort of others. I had, that night, been forced into an unwanted spotlight. The paradox is that sometimes the only way the people you love will understand you is to be the person who refuses to abdicate the work you were called to do. I still drive the van. I still stop at the warehouse and pick up the meal prep crates. The job requires me to straddle two worlds. The one that picks up Amazon packages and the one that secures ministers and presidents. The duality is exhausting, absurd, and strangely liberating. It is an odd kind of freedom to be invisible when you want to be invisible when it matters. There are mornings I wake up to the echo of cigarette smoke and foreign bases, and afternoons I change a flat tire in a suburban parking lot. There are evenings I make a dinner that tastes like nothing special, and other nights I replay the map of Rockville Pike to see where we could have done better. The life is irregular, calibrated by crisis and by the steady need for maintenance. It is not glamorous. It is not easy. It is mine. As for the Hargrove estate, it remains a story that my family tells in altered fashion, sometimes with comic effect, sometimes with a twinge of awe. Lena tells the story at Christmas now, but includes, in halting phrase, the fact that I was needed. Her voice carries more respect in it. My mother, who once clipped grocery coupons like talismans to keep me small, now keeps a framed photograph of a newspaper clipping that shows a blurred figure leaning over a car in the glow of emergency lights. She asks me every so often for my endorsement of a restaurant or a dress or a gift. We trade small courtesies like a new language. I am not naive enough to expect that everything has been mended. People retain their habits because habits comfort them. But there is a thaw that occurred, not dramatic, but a steady, patient unfreezing that allows for new interactions. My parents' acceptance didn't become an overnight conversion. It became a series of small actions that added up. They began to call me on days I had simply survived rather than to ask whether my life was an object lesson. And I learned something essential in the wake of that night. That you cannot demand respect from people who have built their comfort on denying you your full self. You can, however, choose to keep performing your duty and let your life create its own evidence. People may or may not acknowledge it. That is their problem. Your worth is not a commodity to be exchanged for their peace of mind. Sometimes, when I'm driving late and the radio hums low, I think about the way the world insists that a woman's value is easily summarized. The fact that society will compress complex lives into a paragraph is not new. But the thing that has become clear to me is that we need not accept those paragraphs as scripture. We can live longer sentences. If there's a lesson from that night, not a pithy slogan, but a hard-earned truth, it's this. Do the thing you're meant to do with skill and with rigorous kindness to those you protect. Don't beg for applause. If it comes, accept it as a rare and fragile commodity. If it doesn't, keep going. The work will prove its value in ways your family's small secret scripts never will. The road keeps moving. My van has new dents. My hands still smell faintly of solvent. And there are nights when the memory of Lena's laughter cuts deep, and other nights when the secretary's handshake feels like a warm stone I keep in my pocket. I keep the badge tucked in my wallet and the photograph of the debriefing in a drawer. They are not trophies. They are markers. They remind me that some parts of life demand everything and give nothing tangible in return. Sometimes in the quiet that comes after a long drive, I write letters I never mail. I write them to the younger version of myself who thought that being dutiful meant shrinking. I write them to the sister who chose a narrative that made her feel taller. I write them to my parents, not to shame but to explain. Writing is a therapy for me, a mapping of what matters. I still go to Costco when the house actually needs something heavy. I may pull my van into a suburban driveway and haul cases of sparkling water and soda because sometimes family is a thing that requires practical help. But I do those things on my terms. If anyone assumes that because I can carry a box I lack complexity, they do so at their peril. At the end of the day, the truth I want to pass along is not revolutionary. It's simple and stubborn. Your worth is not defined by the story others tell about you. It is defined by the life you live when no one is watching, by the choices you make under pressure, and by the quiet competence you bring to the world's messes. I do not require my family's applause. I only require my own integrity. And so the van keeps moving, the radio keeps humming, and the world keeps spinning in its messy, glorious, indifferent orbit. My hands are still versed in the motion of cleaning and oiling and assembling. I still answer the call that comes through the secure line like a bell in the night. I still drive away from parties and toward crises. I still return to quiet moments in my kitchen and the smell of solvent. I still make the choice to be who I am. If you find yourself boxed into a story that makes you small to make others comfortable, know that you can choose differently. The courage to do so does not look the way you think. It is rarely dramatic in the way films depict it. It is often the mundane accumulation of decisions that prioritize truth over applause. It is the steadiness to continue when your life is reduced to something else by people who prefer the tidy to the real. There are nights I long for a life where nobody knows where I am all the time because I like being a person who never has to explain. But there is also a fierce satisfaction in the fact that when the world leaned into crisis that night, the person they laughed at was the one who stepped forward. That very contradiction, being a marvel to the state and a joke to the dinner table, is not a problem to be solved but a tension to live within. So I keep driving. I clean the weapons with care, minding the recoils spring the way you mind a temperamental engine. I go to parties when I'm asked and I leave when the call comes. I do what I must. I do it my way, not for trumpets or trophies, but because it's the work I was put in place to do. If you ever see a woman in a modest dress who carries herself with an odd sort of humility, and who insists on staying late to help take out the trash at a family function, don't be surprised if she's also the person who would willingly drive into the erupting dark to pull someone from harm. People are complicated. Lives are layered. Don't let a single domestic joke define the whole truth of someone you love. In the quiet after another mission, I sometimes tilt my head back and watch the sky get lighter on the horizon. The dawn always comes. It is a small comfort and a large reminder. There will always be work to do, and someday you'll be judged for the little things you never had the bandwidth to explain. Do them anyway.